Welcome to Writers of Silicon Valley, the podcast where I interview the best UX writers and content strategists from around the world. One of the worst parts of creating a podcast is figuring out how you're going to introduce it. Am I going to be witty and say something clever? Am I going to be dramatic with lots of big music and effects? Or am I going to tease it out and ask lots of questions at the beginning so you can't figure out what this is or what's actually going on? Anyway, I hate podcast introductions that drag on for too long, so I'm going to dispense with a long one and just get to the point. Everyone talks about coding being the next big thing. We all need to learn to code, we all need to learn how software works, we all need to figure out how to create our own apps. But if everyone learns to code, coding becomes the new normal. And if everyone is normal, what becomes extraordinary? If you listen to what the real decision makers in Silicon Valley and around the world are saying, they're saying the real opportunities in the future will be problem solving and soft skills, creative decision making. That's why the role of the UX writer and content strategist has become such a big deal. I get really frustrated when I hear people say there aren't opportunities for people with creative skills in technology, because UX writing is exactly that. It's this combination of technical skill and artful problem solving, and there are already hundreds of people doing this. And if you jump on LinkedIn and have a look at the job ads section, there are hundreds of other companies looking for more of them. So, who am I? I'm Patrick Stafford. I'm a senior digital copywriter at MYOB, the largest accounting software provider in Australia. I do UX writing in my main role, and I've been wanting to hear from people who do this job too, to speak with people at companies that I look up to learn more about what they do and how they do their jobs, and the type of work we're going to be doing in the future. Because these concepts like chatbots and conversational interfaces, Alexa skills, Siri, they're all created by writers. And search via voice is going to be one of the biggest pillars of customer experience in the next several decades. I want to hear more from people who are doing this kind of work, not only to learn myself, but to help others get inspired as well. So that's what this podcast is about. Nothing fancy, no gimmicks, just conversations with UX writers and content strategists. I'm not an audio engineer. I'm not a podcast expert. I just want to talk to people who I find interesting and then share that with you. So, a couple of things to start. First of all, you're going to have to forgive. There's going to be some audio glitches here and there. The sound quality is not going to be amazing, at least to start with. But I really hope you'll stick with me because over the past several weeks, I've been conducting some pretty interesting conversations with people, and I really think you're going to get a lot out of them. The first conversation I'm starting with is Roy West. Roy West is the design director of UX writing at Uber, and he's perhaps one of the most fascinating people I've ever spoken with, not only because of the work he's doing now, but because of the work he's been doing over the past several decades. He came to Silicon Valley in the 80s and started working at companies like Next, which, if you know anything about Silicon Valley history, was a really interesting place to be, especially in the early 90s when Roy was there. He then went on to do lots of other things, including working at Google, and is now the design director of UX writing at Uber, where he's doing some really interesting things. I learned a lot from this conversation. I think you're going to as well. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Roy West. And I'm really interested to understand how you got into this work in the first place.
Sure. So a little more accurately, I started in trade book publishing. Mm-hmm. I got a job in the early 80s when I moved to San Francisco with a book packager called the Compage Company, which is run by a fellow named Ken Burke, who's sadly not with us anymore, who partnered with a printer to package editorial and production and printing for a variety of different companies. They focused on how-to books. So he had a very popular physics textbook that he kept after he left New York Publishing and came out west. And he, let's see. So they sold the idea of how-to books on a number of household and gardening and small construction project kind of how-to books to a couple different folks. They did work for Sunset Books. Sunset is a Western lifestyle magazine based in California. They sold the idea of ortho books to a garden chemical and household products company called Ortho that was part of Chevron and invented that line of books that were very popular for a while. They also did work for Time Life Books. So there was this milieu of knowing how to produce books that taught people how to do things. And then as the computer industry was beginning to try to reach out to a popular audience, they looked for people who could help them teach people how to use computers, and they turned to Compage and places like that to help them build out the ability to create user education in book form. So I started in this company answering the phone and typing on a CPM machine with a teak case because they wouldn't have an ugly PC in the office in the early 80s. And I learned a good deal about how that kind of book is made. I learned a good deal about how editorial is done. I learned how, we have hundreds of years of tradition and process for how to produce something that's pretty close to perfect in terms of quality for very little money through strategy and division of labor and things like that, through the editorial process, through printing and production know-how. So I was there for about 5 years, and I was, at the end of that time, I was responsible for a series of book projects for Apple and other vendors. And I had a writer quit, and I thought, you know what, I want to write this. And they couldn't keep me on as a writer, so that's where I switched over to writing. And that was really where I began working as a technical writer. I'll say at Compage, and later what I learned was to look at the software and not at the book in terms of the first place to try to fix things. So at Compage, the very talented editors I worked with were consulting with these computer companies to say, if you did this differently with your software, it might be easier to use. And that was really my entree into a career of working in documentation, but also that was focused on looking at the product and using an editorial and developmental editorial eye towards bringing coherence and consistency to user interfaces, as frequently as part of an engineering team, an embedded writer in an engineering team.
That's very early for that type of work, because I think a lot of people tend to assume that technical writing is something that happens post-fact. So something is created and then technical documentation comes afterwards. But as you say, that's a really interesting early example of how those two things could be integrated together.
Sure. Though, it's an idea that's been around for a long time. There was a very popular programming journal for the Macintosh community called Dr. Dobbs Journal in the 80s. And there was an article that struck me once at the time that where the argument was you should write the documentation first and then design your product. The idea being would allow you to think in a coherent way about what's the functionality and how does it fit together and how does it serve a user by basically working on the documentation and then back to the user interface and then back to the code. And I think that informs a lot of what many of us on the UX writing side of things think of, right? How can we bring that editorial and writing skill set to bear for thinking about how to design product?
It's such an interesting time too, in that in San Francisco at that time. Did you fly over because you were interested in tech and you wanted to get in on the industry, or as you said, you went to work for a publisher? So was it more of you wanted an editorial job?
It's much more organic than that. My girlfriend moved out here, and
okay.
I thought she was fabulous, and so I followed her. And 31 years later, we're longer than that. We're still married. So
lovely.
I think it was a good move. It was a good move in a lot of ways.
Definitely sounds like it. So what was the vibe like at the time? Because the way you look back now, you think, and I'm only 31, so everything I know about tech in San Francisco in the early 80s is what I see and read through movies and articles and perhaps talking to some people like yourself who were there. And the way it comes across to me, it was this really vibrant, exciting, fast-moving time where lots of cool things were happening all the time. similar to perhaps the way it is now even. What was it like during that time being connected to that industry?
There's a couple things I'll say. I think that in the early 80s, the tech industry was still much more influenced by the sort of previous generation of engineering. Mm-hmm. And the hallmark of that I found as I was working with products that didn't quite work. I mean, we were all kinds of hardware and software that we take for granted, all the kinds of communications things we do now. But at the time, we were struggling with modems and pinouts on cables to make our computers talk in the most rudimentary way to bulletin boards, using telephones as the way to connect the computers together. There was a much more of a handmade aspect to it. And I think that the reason I bring this up is that one of the things that struck me about dealing with engineers in these companies was an enormous generosity of sharing know-how that I still remember quite clearly and shapes my view about how we work together. I can't tell you how often somebody at some company would take time that they didn't have and very patiently walk me through how to solder up some cable in order to get the computer connected to the phone, right? Things like that. Another thing I'll say is that I think we're compressing some events. I think that there was a great deal of work in between the excitement.
Sure.
So we mustn't compress too much. I think there was also a great sense of optimism about the potential for connected computers. Also, for desktop publishing, we don't think about that technology much anymore, but for technical writers, it was so influential. And then for the way we all think about the world, that what turned into the web, that going back to the laser writer and some of these page makeup products that then they morphed into the tools that we also now use to create web pages and blogs, right? There's a lineage there. There was an enormous optimism about the potential for putting the press in the hands of the people, if you will, right? You got to remember, I live in Berkeley, so some of that political worldview rubs off. But I very much shared that view about a democratizing influence of technology, both in terms of know-how and that generosity, but also about the potential for technology to empower people.
When you speak about empowerment, it seems like the way that technology has changed over the past 30, 35 years has, in some ways, it's kept that democratized spirit. And in other ways, it's become a lot more patented, a lot more boxed in between not only companies, but engineers and even writers, perhaps. What do you see as having changed in that time? Do you still see that spirit of democracy in San Francisco and the tech industry?
I do, and I think that you can read online far more informed people than I am on this subject. But I'll say that certainly the spirit at a place like Google, right, or even a place like Uber now, where I am, is viewing technology as a tool for empowering people. But at the same time, just in the past couple of years, the implications. All the implications of that technology are becoming more visible to us in ways that you and the people that would listen to this would be very familiar. What's happened at Facebook, what's happened with Twitter, should Google go back into China, or the implications of that or not? What are the implications of the Great Firewall and similar kinds of internet censorship, which happens in many other countries? Also, what are the implications of anyone being able to spin up a website like InfoWars and have a profoundly divergent view of the world that in many cases people view as quite destructive? That utopianism, in a way, is we're all looking very hard at that and trying to have to grow up a bit about how we think about it. But the idealism, I don't think, is gone. It's an idealism that's realizing that it has to grow up and figure out how do we act responsibly also.
Yeah, I completely agree. So you're in the 80s, you're creating this technical documentation, and then after that sort of period, where do you go? Where do you go next?
So I worked freelance as a writer for a little bit. Where I went next was to the company that Steve Jobs founded after he was forced out of Apple. And I joined there shortly after the the Cube was released. It had just acquired a magneto-optical drive, modern wonder of the world that it was. And I went in there as a contractor working on user documentation, and then converted and stayed on there for about 5 years, working on system administration documentation and also user documentation. And then we also worked very hard to take what we had learned from folks who came out of Compage with me and others about accessible, task-focused user documentation and convert that into usable online help. And we were sort of pleased with our system. And then we began to see this thing called the web. And we realized that that actually HTML was clearly the way to go with that. So we threw all that away and re-implemented it all in HTML. And that was sort of an early use of HTML, was to power, obviously many things on the web, but also online docs, online help.
There's so much I want to ask you about this period, and I think we could spend hours talking about it. How did you even come to Next in the first place? Was there someone there who you knew, or was there a job opening?
Yeah, there was a job opening, and I interviewed with a woman I've worked with since, a brilliant writer named Helen Casabona, and then also a really innovative technical writer and editor named Caroline Rose, who had been instrumental in the Inside Macintosh work, which was sort of groundbreaking developer documentation that I actually had touched at Compage as a consultant. That wasn't my connection there, but I interviewed with them, and I guess I must have made a good impression because they hired me.
The romantic way that I sort of thought about it when I initially saw that you had worked at Next was that, Steve Jobs came to him and asked him to come and write the documentation, and it was a very, very close relationship. That's the romantic thing you have in your head. But of course, it was a big company by that point, and it had processes, and there were lots of people, and it was a fast-moving train, I would have imagined.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that what Helen and I, a brilliant editor and writer named Kathy Vian, who I introduced to them and who I met at Compage, brought to Next was thinking about user documentation and user education in the ways that I had learned at Compage, right? Mm-hmm. Much more sort of thinking about tasks and reference, how they fit together, a much more telegraphic style, a much more visual style of presenting information that is still, you still see on the web, right? I mean, their roots go back to this, right? And at the time, Next was very academic oriented, and so it had created. They were basically meant to be like thick textbooks that were the documentation for both how to use the product and also how to code, right, in Objective-C, and use the tools that they'd built. And I think that what we did there, and not me alone, right, part of that team was to move over to the sort of Macintosh style of graphical layout, of using graphical design to serve the editorial role, which I torment my design friends from time to time by reminding them that, of course, the role of graphical design is to serve editorial. And we certainly tried to take advantage of extraordinarily gifted graphic design at Next. Jeff Yaczyk, the tragically late Keith Olfs, but in particular Jeff helped with a really modern and groundbreaking approach to laying out user education in printed form. And then, as I say, through RTF and then HTML, these online help forms.
Was there any pushback to the types of work you were doing? Because the way I imagine is that before the 1980s, when you see this explosion in consumer PCs, technology was very much something that confused a lot of people, and it seemed like this tower of knowledge that you could never climb. And the way you describe it, seems to be, again, as you mentioned before, democratized, accessible. Was there any pushback to the type of work and approach you were taking, or was it very much everyone getting on board?
No, and I'll say, so here's the thing. I would say one of the things I consider myself most fortunate about in my career is that, at Next, at B, at Google, at Uber, I've gotten to work with just extraordinarily intelligent people, and people who, they may have had egos, but they also knew how to listen and see good ideas and run with them. And there may have been some questioning about shifting away from that sort of funny textbook format, but I think that when people saw what we were proposing, that the common sense appeal of it won people over because they were intelligent enough to understand what the goal was and what it was achieving. So I would say no, there wasn't a great deal of pushback. Another hallmark of these places that I worked, and again, I feel very fortunate in this way, is that there was a culture of people figuring out what the right thing to do was and maybe ask some hard questions, but there's not a ton of second guessing, right? Now, that may happen in some areas to some people, but that hasn't been my experience, is that if you do good work and you can speak to it and speak intelligently to the reasons why you're doing it, there isn't a lot of sort of inappropriate pushback. There may not be support, there may not be funding, there may not be wild endorsement, but people aren't telling you, no, you've got to go do this some other way.
Hey everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt the interview, but I wanted to tell you about something that I've been working on recently. Last year, some senior UX writers from Google, Amazon, and I got together, and we started talking about a problem we see in our industry, which is that there aren't a lot of opportunities for people to learn how to become a UX writer. So we solved that. We've started something called the UX Writers Collective, and we offer an online, self-paced course in UX writing fundamentals. And it's going off. We launched in January, and we already have over 60 students who are taking the course right now. And we're getting endorsements from people like Jen Schaefer, who's the content manager at Netflix, and Catherine Strauss, who manages the UX Writers Meetup in San Francisco. The reason they're endorsing us is because we don't just teach students how to write little pieces of microcopy. We're telling them how to be part of a full design team, which means, yes, they're learning about voice and tone, but they're also learning about how do you test copy, how do you integrate within the workflow of a design team, how do you actually analyze results, and what are the types of things you just need to do every day. And that's the reason we have so many people coming to the course, and we'd love for you to try it out. If you're just learning UX writing, if you want to renew your skills, or if you're a coder, developer, engineer, or any other type of professional who wants to learn about UX writing, then we think this is the course for you. It's uxwriterscollective.com, and because you're listening to this podcast, you can get 20% off. Just check out with the code podcast20. That's uxwriterscollective.com. Check out with the code podcast20. Now back to the interview.
So the Macintosh was really quite groundbreaking in how they approached user education. We had inherited some of the success of the Macintosh as an approachable platform, and that meant not just the user interface, but also the way the user education worked. I worked with a fellow named George Truitt, Kathy Vion, Carol Westberg, some of these other folks at Compage on how to teach people how to use a mouse, how to edit text with a cursor, right? A lot of that we take for granted now,
Yeah.
right? That we need to teach somebody how to do that, but there was pages of the original Mac and McWrite manuals dedicated to how to do that stuff, right? To teach people how to do that, and it worked, right? And so by the time we get to Next, there was an openness to understanding that there were ways of teaching people how to do things that were not dense text.
And I think you see that when, or at least you'll be able to tell me this, when you get to Google. And I know that we're skipping a number of years here, and you did a lot of work in between Next and going to Google. But I just want to speak about Google particularly because you were there for quite a long time. I think about 8 or 9 years. Is that right?
That's 9 years.
Yeah, and I see that Google products beginning from around that time, or perhaps a little earlier, there was very much this emphasis on being able to construct these products in a way that people could teach themselves how to use them and then integrate them into their daily lives. And I'm interested to, perhaps there's things you can't talk about, which is perfectly fine, but I'm interested to hear you talk about that time in particular, because I'd love to know, at Google, was there that drive to really make things as accessible as possible? What was the guiding philosophy for the type of writing there? Because that's really when you start moving from, I think, technical writing into that what we would now call UX writing. Would that be fair to say?
So keep in mind that, let's split technical writing into two pieces. One is writing for developers, teaching developers how to code. Not teaching them how to code, but teaching them how to use libraries or languages that are new to them for a specific purpose. And the other is a broader audience on how to use software to accomplish tasks. And so I came into an environment that had dedicated user experience design, interaction design, visual design, research as recognized, established disciplines. And that was a huge eye-opener for me and an enormous education. I had been director of UI at my previous company, but I was now working with these folks who had really studied UI in a formal way, and I realized I had so much really to learn from them, even though I had much more industry experience. So it was, then the battle was, where does writing fit into that? I was hired at Android to write user documentation, but also to be responsible for the text in the UI. And I kept both of those things going for a couple of years before I got recruited over to the product that was going to turn into Google+. And the guy I'd worked with, who'd seen me struggle on online help while at the same time working on the UI, had said, okay, I really want you to come and work on this, but you're not allowed to work on online help anymore. And I was a little surprised, but sort of relieved. And he was half joking. We were friends, right? And he pointed out that the product's going to survive, that Google Plus was going to survive or fail based on the UI and other considerations and not on the help. And I still care a great deal about help. It's essential. But it was the first time that it was about 2011, where I was responsible just for the text on the screen, and I really had no other responsibilities. And I think I was the second person at Google who had that responsibility. The first was the phenomenal Sue Factor, who's now retired. But we all were starting in on that at about the same time. In around 2009, 2010, increasingly the UI became the focus. And then for me, the switch over to full-time doing that was in 2011. But keep in mind, that had been my role at all my previous companies. I always sought jobs that were in engineering, not in marketing or other areas of the company, so that I would be hands-on with engineering and with the product. And I found that collaboration between writing and creative and engineering creative hugely rewarding. And in fact, it's something I worry about now with the rise of the product management culture. There's now something of a barrier between design and engineering that I don't think is healthy. And I think we need to rethink how that works, because as much as I admire and appreciate the role of product management, there's that connection is getting broken, and I don't think it's healthy for product.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's interesting that you talk about when you get to Google, there was this, you're now exposed to this world of UX design
Yes.
on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's something that it's a really hot topic in UX circles right now. How do writers and designers collaborate, and how do they join together? Because I often speak to younger writers who will call themselves a UX writer, but what they've done is copywriting before, and they haven't worked with the UX team, and now they're calling themselves a UX writer because they think it's going to be easier to land a job. They don't actually have that collaboration between the two disciplines. So was that a breath of fresh air for you, or were you having to really rethink some of the ways you had been working previously?
So the surprise was actually a little bit different. I was very accustomed to working with engineering to make user interfaces more intuitive and selfishly easier to document. The thing that caught me by surprise and ultimately was so rewarding for me was to discover that you could study interaction design as a discipline and become really quite adept at it in a way that I really realized I was almost an amateur at, even for all the years that I'd been working with gifted UI folks and such. And so, but I would say that certainly at Uber, the way we've been trying to articulate this is that the writers on the product design team are designers. And they need to understand that their first role is partnering with design and research, who are also designers, to create product. And that means that the most fruitful teams, and I saw this at Google as well, is where we have writing and design and research tightly bound together, working together, right? Traveling to do research together, looking at mocks together, talking through from ideation through looking at logs after you ship. They're all working together with their particular strengths they're bringing to the table, but becoming extremely familiar with the disciplines that they're partnering with. So a writer who is not thinking about that their words are in service of a user intent and of a flow that is designed to facilitate accomplishment of a task in an as intuitive and friction-free way as possible is missing the point of what we're doing. I would say that it was hardest, I think, for people who come out of marketing and places like that, where the words are you're trying to sell the words in a way, right? The words are drawing attention to themselves in order to make a connection with a reader. Whereas with UX writing, frequently we're trying to hide, right? We're trying to use language to create this frictionless experience where you don't even realize you're looking at the words. You're not reading anything. You are intuiting it just as you intuit the grace of the visual aspect of the graphical design in order to accomplish your task. And you get your task done. You didn't even think about it, right? That was what was delightful. You didn't have to stop and ponder, what do I do? It helped you get the thing done and you've moved on.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting to me to learn how rare that is. I assumed this was the norm in a lot of other companies. But speaking to other UX writers, unfortunately, it's not. They're great UX writers, but for whatever the reason, their culture just doesn't allow them to, for instance, be involved in the research or walk with the designers alongside designing something. So they end up getting a design, having to write for it, and they haven't seen it before. It's unfortunate, really, and I really hope some work's done in the next few years to change that. Because as you said, the most fruitful teams are the ones that are collaborating the most.
Well, let's talk about what fruitful means. Fruitful means these are products that are successful and will be successful in the market. And so I think this will be self-correcting over time. It's like a lot of things that people can stick with certain ways of doing things, but the better ways of doing things that produce better, more profitable products, just to be blunt, more successful products, those are the ones that are going to be successful as companies. And it's just crippling to be asked to come in to look at a design after it's been done and say, please, we're having trouble with this part of the flow. Could you rename this button? There is no writer in the world frequently who can solve that problem with writing. Frequently it's a fundamental flow problem that the writer being involved earlier might have been able to help with, or might have been able to point it out. They would have discovered earlier that it wasn't solvable by just renaming a button. So that product is not going to do well. That team is not going to do well.
Yeah.
So
the problem was 3 steps ago. And I find this actually sometimes even in UX writer circles where we adhere to these principles and they're almost taken as laws, but sometimes they don't provide the best experience. One of the things that I always brush up against is the principle that UX writing should be as short as possible, as snappy as possible, and just the fewer words the better. On the whole, that's absolutely correct. You don't need 5 words where 1 will do. But it does lead to sometimes this miscommunication between design and writing, where design will not allow for a particular block of text where actually 4 sentences might be appropriate, together with like a headline that might summarize what you're looking for legibility. So it's interesting, these little schisms pop up every now and then that I think we just need to be cognizant of. But you're absolutely right. This should be self-correcting over time. I think. But
So
as to how long that takes, I guess we'll have to see.
yeah. So, and I think you're right. So about so Sue Factor came up with this phrase and this fabulous internal document from that I wish were available outside of Google called Short Beats Good, which was this first sort of explanation about how to think about UX writing. Really groundbreaking document that, again, I wish was more widely available. But we have these rules that are developing about brevity, about always be in the present tense, about all kinds of things like that. But I believe we are really at early days of really understanding what best practices are for all the writing, for all the different kinds of user interfaces. And this is where being wedded to our research partners and learning more about research, how to conduct our own research, this is one of the main things I'm driving with my team and with my partner in research at Uber, and is to be more tightly coupled with research to, why isn't it working well? What if we added a little more information? I saw that happen repeatedly at Google, where we thought that by being as pithy as possible, we knew that was successful as a rule, but then at certain key inflection points with very visible, very prominent moments in Google products, discovering that adding a little more text, a little more explanation, a little more information, even much more information, produced a better product. So again, we have these guidelines. I don't think we've tested them very well. I think on the whole, they're good guidelines. They're well thought through. They're reasonably effective, but we don't really know. And it's something that I'm excited to work on in the coming year or two, is to get a little more rigorous about how we measure these things.
Yeah, I think it's contextual, right? I think it really depends on the product. It depends on the team. It depends on the culture. One of the things that I've spoken to UX writers about, and I'm seeing this more and more, if you look at job ads, more companies looking for UX writers are looking for people with a journalism background. And my background's in journalism. I used to be a business journalist. And I actually think there's a lot of crossover because in journalism, 90% of what you're doing is research. The writing only comes at the very end. I can bang out 2,000 words in, a couple of hours. That's really not a problem. But if I haven't done the 3 weeks of research beforehand, I'm not going to get anything done.
So you're pushing one of my buttons about what's the right background for a UX writer.
Okay.
The journalism happens not to be my background, but this is a young enough discipline that when we're hiring, we can't limit ourselves to hiring people who've done exactly what we need before.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
10 years from now, that'll be a little bit different, but that isn't the case now, and it certainly wasn't the case 5 years ago. And I'll say that one of the richest sources of UX writing talent, in my experience, was from journalism. And I've given a good deal of thought about that. Two of the most talented leaders in UX writing at Google right now, one came out of the LA Bureau of the Washington Post. The other came out of New York magazine publishing, Martha Stewart Living, that sort of thing. Brilliant, brilliant writers, very thoughtful, both on the strategy side and then on the sort of focused execution side. And so why, right? I have to go back to my high school English, to what they taught me about journalism. You have a pyramidal, or some say this inverted pyramid structure of information, which in UI we call progressive disclosure, right? So then you're structuring your content so that, on a newspaper, the headline, you can read the headline on a newspaper that you read often, and frequently you don't need to read the article. And that's so related to titles and buttons and things in UI, right? Is that we come up with this vocabulary and set of idioms that reveal what's behind there without the words really giving you that much information, right? And then the first paragraph or sentence, the first paragraph, that's diving in deeper into a UI where you get more context for a specific task. They're also used to dealing with horrible space constraints, and they're used to being not owning their own copy, so their language isn't precious, right? Some editor is going to rewrite it, and that's just fine, and it might be better, right? So they've learned how to collaborate as writers, and they also know how to ask the right questions and keep asking until they feel that they've proved to themselves that they understand the topic well enough and the issue well enough to be able to explain it to other people. So all of those things, I think. And then at some point they were an intern and someone forced them to memorize AP Style or Chicago Manual or some other reference. So they really got the nuts and bolts of how to use punctuation and all that stuff that we, in tech, we rarely have an editor to work behind us. We have to know that stuff to be able to produce polished work. So all those things together is a training ground and a mindset that I think is a very rich source of the kind of thinking that we're talking about. So then the big leap is, can you take that and transition it from telling a story about an event to telling the story of a flow, of a process, right? And I see people make that jump. Not everyone can, but I see people making that. There's several examples I can think of that demonstrate that.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that really helps is being able to, as a journalist, I needed to identify and interact with multiple different sources of information. That could be researching documents, it could be talking to people, it could be data. And then I need to evaluate those sources and decide which of these am I going to emphasize for this particular story. And in fact, sometimes which am I going to disappoint because I'm not going to provide the story that they necessarily want to. For instance, that source could be internal stakeholders who you may have to disappoint because you're going to have to emphasize certain sources, perhaps data or the results of an A/B test or so on, in your product design, in your writing. I think that's another element that journalism can really provide. And it's just interesting that you mention all this because I have seen this trend growing recently, and I'm interested to see if more journalists jump on, particularly as the job field there becomes, unfortunately, more limited.
Yeah, I'll say one other thing about journalism, about good journalism, is that that learning how to write. In spite of what I said before about having your language disappear, there really is a lot to be said for learning how to write in a way that charms and that is positive and that sells. And I don't mean in an overt, hard sell kind of way, but when I think about the newspapers that I gravitate to as a compulsive news reader, they're newspapers like the Washington Post, where the writing is so graceful and so elegant and sometimes funny or arch, but it's giving me the information that I need in a way that is a joy, right? That it's a pleasure to read. And I think that I often talk to people about the need to be positive in a user interface and the way that people who are negative and how it's kind of a drag to be with them, and people who are relatively positive and tend to uplift your mood. So in that same way, people understanding that newspapers sell because people want to read that stuff, right? And whether it's now moved online or not, very dry, uninteresting writing does not grab readers. So I think there's something there from journalism as well.
Look, Roy, I could sit here and talk to you for hours about all this, but I've taken up enough of your time already. In fact, more than I said I would. So I do just want to wrap up here and be respectful of your time. But before we finish, I just want to ask quickly. This is something that I'm asking everyone at the end. For anyone who's wanting to get into UX writing, or for UX writers now who may have a lot of experience, what's something they should go and read, to something that's perhaps given you some value as to how you improve your writing or the way you think about content and content strategy? Is there something that you would recommend people go and have a look at?
Yeah, so I wrote about this a little bit on LinkedIn in the last couple of months. I'm seeing a really nice sort of flowering of writing about this discipline starting to come out. And you could find it on places like Medium, right? And some of these other sites that write about UI and design. Another thing that we haven't really talked about, but which I think is bringing fresh life and creative thought into the role of language and user interfaces is voice and chat interfaces. And a book that I just thought was just fabulous and timely is this book, Conversational Design by Erica Hall, that's from a little press called A Book Apart. I think that she just encapsulates at just the right level a lot of what's going on right now in thinking about the role of language in user interfaces, about the role of thinking about this notion of conversational design, which I think is that's not a new idea that you would use conversation as a metaphor or as a tool for thinking about the flow of a user interface. But I think she just does a wonderful job of talking about how the discipline of voice UI design and then just thinking about conversation and its role in user interfaces in general is. But I'm just saying that I just think it's a very timely book, and I think that it's short and cheap and worth anyone reading at any level.
Yeah, I think this is only going to become more important, and particularly, even I've been thinking about this recently about, okay, if I'm setting myself up for the next 10 years, I really need to be building some bots, even if it's just on my own, creating those conversational flows and presenting a process of how I can design and then, in practical terms, create that conversation. Again, even if it's not for a specific product, even if it's just on my own, those are the types of skills I'm going to have to start integrating in a much, much more practical way. And it's probably something that younger UX writers should be looking at as well.
I think any UX writer who wants to have confidence in being employed 5 years from now had better understand what conversational design is about and what the implications for voice interfaces and chat interfaces are about. I think that this is a technology that we know that this is going to be an essential interface and omnipresent interface sometime soon. I think we've been saying that for 20 or 25 years, but it's still true. And then it's like. Well, I'll just give you a metaphor about this. I have a hobby, very interested in botany, and I work with people who are combating invasive weeds. And a woman I know who is very knowledgeable about ecology and botany said, the funny thing about weeds is you're out in the field and you see a certain weed year after year, and you say, I saw that one this other place. And you see them in singletons, right? And then suddenly they're everywhere. And there's something about that, the way weeds invade, that it seems like they're not there, they're just here and there, and suddenly they're everywhere. And I think that we saw that with cell phones a few years ago, and I think we're going to see that with voice user interfaces soon. It's sort of here and there. Sometimes it's a little more established here, but suddenly we'll look back and we'll be shocked that somehow there was a time before this. And we as writers and we as people who are creating a bridge between product and the things that you do with product and people who are trying to get them done, conversational, spoken, chat-based user interfaces are around the corner.
Fantastic. Well, Roy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate your time. And if people want to come find you or follow you online, where can they do that?
I'm not very present online, I'm afraid. I am on LinkedIn, and I do post there occasionally.
Don't connect with Roy if you don't know him. Just read his articles. Don't be intrusive. Roy, again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Patrick.